Well, hello. My name is Mark DuPont. I'm one of the instructors with LSU's National Center for Biomedical Research and Training. And I'll take about 30 minutes of your time just to talk about some best practices as it relates to virtual training. It's something that is becoming increasingly the norm. And the reality is, in light of this pandemic, although a lot of people have been forced into the virtual world, the reality is it's here to stay. And it's here to stay for a lot of reasons. One of them is it works. Here's a news flash, and it comes from Brian Dashu's article. I'll give you a link to that article. The title is, "After COVID-19 Comes the Biggest Workforce Challenge Since World War II." I want to quote an actual paragraph in that article. "We must think of this challenge from both the perspective of adult educators and learners. Standard models of training will be insufficient to face the challenge because there is not sufficient expertise for training all people. And simply trying to increase the scale of traditional trainer roles through train-the-trainer programs will take time and human resources that render it economically unviable. The key to our preparation will be developing new competencies and skills for designing job training that is based on our understanding of how people learn in the 21st century." Here's the most significant part of that paragraph: how people learn in the 21st century. Virtual training isn't new. It's not something that just was formed as a result of the pandemic. It's something that's been around for a couple of decades. It started off being called e-learning. There was even computer-based training that I'm sure many of you, maybe even watching this, have been a part of or used in your line of work. The latest before the turn of the 21st century was mobile learning. But I think the new definition and the new title is really what I call a digital learning experience. I think that phrase is so appropriate because if we look at how we train our students with the mindset that this is a journey that we're taking them on, I think it really focuses on what a virtual learning experience should be. And what I'm going to go over is some best practices and some tools that you can take and apply when you are in front of that camera in your virtual classrooms. So how can we do it best? What particular skills can we apply? What tools can we use that will make that learning experience absolutely perfect? I'm going to give you some best practices, and I'm going to break it down into what I call the 4 Ps of a digital learning journey. It's people, it's platform, it's process, and it's the actual performance of the teaching. Let's go inside to my virtual classroom, and we'll break those down into some tools that you can apply. All right, so we're in the virtual classroom, and let's break down the 4 Ps that I discussed. The first, of course, is people, your students. It's the most important part of the 4 Ps. And as teachers, as trainers, as instructors, we know that if we want to have a good learning experience, then our focus must be on creating a learner-centered environment. That's one of the principles at NCBRT for all of our courses. So how can we do that in a virtual environment? Well, first, you need to understand your audience. The more you can find out about them beforehand, the better prepared you can be for them when you enter the virtual classroom. The more you can make them feel like they're part of a community when they're in this virtual classroom. So how do you find that out? Well, one of the benefits of the digital learning experience, I made mention of it a little bit, is that it extends our opportunity to engage with our students. And one of the ways it extends it is in pre-engagement. One of the ways I can find out more about them is having them do some things before the class even begins, whether it's a homework assignment, whether it's a learning opportunity for them to read something, for them to watch a video, or for them to go through some sort of introduction exercise, something like we use in the instructor development workshop. So if I know more about them, I also need to know what their expectations are. Using that helps you to formulate your plan on how you're going to deliver the materials you're about to deliver and make sure that you connect with them. One of the great tools in the virtual classroom to capture what they want to get out of this is having them type it in chat. It's a fantastic tool. We'll talk more and more about that and how you can use that throughout your delivery. But chat is a great tool to not only have them engage, but to have you the opportunity to capture what they're saying. So I know why they want to be there. I know what they want to get out of it. I also need to set my own expectations. That's an important part of the virtual training environment. I have to be aware of time. Time in the virtual world is different than the time in the physical world. It's almost like a parallel universe. It moves faster. And part of the reason it moves faster is because there's a lot that we want to accomplish in the virtual classroom. There's a lot of engagement that we want to have happen, and that just takes a little bit more time. So we have to be conscious of that, be very aware of that. And I'll give you some things that we can do when we get into the process part of this, how you can make sure that you're aligning your time to the most benefit of both you and your students. So knowing my expectations, what I want to achieve out of this, how I can manage that time, and also recognizing what I'm competing against is something that I have to take into consideration going into that virtual classroom. Things like Facebook, email, noises in the place where that student is sitting, pop-ups that they might be looking at, whether it be on their screen or whether it be something that's going on in their home or their work environment. Those are all things that are going to be distractions and things that you're competing against in the virtual world that you don't necessarily compete with in the physical world. At least it's easier to control in the physical world. So understanding that, knowing what I'm competing against, emphasizes the importance, magnifies the importance of making sure that I engage with them. Engage, engage, engage. I can't say it enough. I can't underline it enough. I can't put it in bold letters enough. Because I'm competing with all those other things that are going on all around that student, I have to make sure I've built in some way to keep those students focused on me and the subject that I'm teaching. And I need to kind of keep a marker in mind somewhere between 3 and 7 minutes. I've got to have them doing something, or I've got to be engaging with them in some way, shape, or form. That's about the attention span we have in the virtual world. If I haven't done something with them, if I haven't had them do something, if I haven't engaged them in some way in that 3 to 7 minute window, then I'm risking I'm going to lose them to those things that I'm competing with. But the question is, how do I engage? What are some of the things, what are some of the tools that I can use? Well, I mentioned chat, but another way to use tools and keep them engaged is things like polls. Another way of using polls is also to get from them some of their experiential background, some of their opinions on things, some way to measure what they want out of this course. It's a great tool. If you're going to use polls, you need to build them ahead of time, and we'll talk about that more when we get into the platform discussion. So I can use polls. I can have them raise their hand either physically or virtually. A lot of these tools, these platform delivery tools, have that capability. We'll talk a little bit more about Zoom in particular because that's what LSU uses. But they all have some way for the students to engage in some way and raise either a virtual hand or click a yes button or click a no button or give a physical thumbs up or give a virtual thumbs up. There's a lot of tools that have that capability as well. So all those are ways that if I ask them something or ask them to do something or ask for their opinion on something or ask what they see or give them a true or false question with regard to what I'm teaching, those are all ways that will help engage them through the process. And the other thing it does, especially when I'm using things like chat, is it starts creating this community. Engagement is important, and creating that sense of community is also important. That's something we really have to focus on in the virtual world, something we take for granted in the physical world. In the physical world, they're all there. They're sitting next to friends and colleagues, and or even if we rearrange the classroom, we're kind of forcing them a little bit to make new friendships and new relationships. In this world, we don't have that luxury of have them literally sitting next to somebody, but we can kind of work through that and give them some tools to build up that sense of relationship and that sense of community. Having them go into breakout rooms is one of those great ways of doing that. So if I have 20 students in a classroom and I break them into groups of 4 or 5, and I send them to either answer a particular question or come up with what they would do in a certain situation, or take their experience and apply their experience to a particular situation, those are all ways that will help not only engage them, but build that sense of community. Inviting them just to answer questions is obviously another traditional tool that we use in the physical classroom, and we can use it here. Having them answer questions, whether it be a general discussion or whether it be a specific and directed question, you can use that tool too. It also gives me as an instructor a way to read the room, right? With all of these engagement tools, I can start seeing who's paying attention, who's not paying attention, who's kind of totally engaged in this, someone who maybe isn't, someone who might be struggling as far as the answers are concerned. So it gives me a great opportunity to watch and read the room. In order to do that, another thing I like to do is have a gallery view of the students that are in the room. Rather than just having it in speaker mode and only seeing those people who speak up or do something, I want to be conscious of everything that's going on in that room and watching those faces as best I can, much like I would in the physical classroom. Key point, folks, is if you're engaging, you're connecting. And if you're connecting, you're creating that whole of community type atmosphere. So having students engage in small buzz groups or conversations is a great way to foster that. Key point here, remember I mentioned earlier about pre-engagement, during the engagement. You can have them do that beforehand as well. You can have them work in small groups and assign them into small groups before they even get into the classroom. You can have them work on a document, whether you're using Google Docs or some sort of online storage tool where people can work on the same document collectively. There's a lot of tools out there. There's a lot of ways to do this. There's a lot of ways to engage them before they even get in the classroom. Most importantly, it's about identifying those learner preferences. We talk a lot about it in the physical classroom, and we focus on it. Sometimes we forget about it in the digital realm, but it still exists. Understanding what their learning preferences are is the same priority as it is in the physical classroom. So using all these tools will help me identify what those different learning preferences are and allow me to connect and accommodate those differences as best I can. Let's go on to the next thing, platforms. So we talked about the people portion of the 4 Ps and how that's so important. Now let's talk about the platform. I will say that it's just as critical as focusing on the people part. And why I say that is, once we've identified what the expectations of the students are, what our expectations are in delivering this particular class or module, we have to make sure that the tools that we're using to do it have the capability to accomplish that. And we have to make sure that we pick the right platforms that has all the tools that I need, or at least that I'm most comfortable with. There's a lot of tools out there. There's GoToMeeting, there's WebEx, there's Adobe Connect, and there's Zoom. At LSU, we're using Zoom. It's a great tool, has a lot of tools that allow us to engage with the students. So if I have the opportunity to pick a tool, I want to make sure that it can do the things that I want it to do. It can do it in a way that's easy and user-friendly, not only for me, but for the students. And last but not least, something that's stable. So we've picked Zoom for all those reasons. It is very stable. But now that I've got the software or the platform that I'm going to use, there's other parts to the platform discussion. It includes the laptop that I'm using or the desktop that I'm using. I want to make sure that that has the capabilities of doing what I want it to do. It's not safe just to assume that because I have a laptop or a desktop that it's going to function well in this virtual environment. Things like video cards, things like memory, things like hard drive, all contribute to the effectiveness and the clearness, if you will, of your delivery. So I want to make sure I've got tools that are capable of operating in this virtual environment effectively. The camera that I have, it's not safe to assume that the quality of the camera that comes with my laptop is good enough for what I want it to do in the virtual environment. Yes, pretty much every laptop out there right now has a camera on it, but they're not all equal. Some don't allow you to do anything with regard to adjusting it as far as how wide they look or how narrow they look. If I have the opportunity, I'm getting an external camera. I'm getting an external camera for a lot of reasons. One, most importantly, I can be confident that it's a tool that can do what I want it to do. It has its own sound capabilities. If I'm going to rely on those, I'll talk about sound in a minute. But definitely, at least for the clarity of the camera, and if I want the camera to actually follow my movements, if I'm doing something, if I have a whiteboard behind me that I'm going to use, and I want the camera to follow me, many of these external cameras have that capability of doing that. So I would strongly recommend you have an external camera. So laptop, camera that I'm using, and then sound. So one of the things I have here is I have an external microphone, just as much as I have a microphone on my laptop and a microphone on my camera. I happen to like this particular microphone because it's portable. I actually have it set up on an external arm, so as I'm standing up, you'll see I'm moving around here. I can move this arm wherever I want to go. Now you can see a little bit of the microphone there, so I can step away from the screen if I want to, from the camera a little bit further back, and ensure that the sound quality is still being maintained. Another thing that I want to consider is how I set up my room. One of the things we want to make sure of is that the camera itself is at eye level with the students. I don't want to be looking up to the students, and I definitely don't want to be looking down. A lot of times you'll see in some presentations where the presenter is using their laptop camera, it's on their desk, they might be sitting a little higher, and it just looks up at them. The fault with that is it gives the students the impression that you're looking down at them, and we don't want that to happen. So make sure that your setup, your classroom is set up at eye level. One other thing that you want to consider is your background. Now I have these framed certificates and things like that, just happens to be how my office is set up. But you may consider doing a virtual background. If you do use a virtual background, and I'm going to use one here just to show you how it works. The risk you have with some of these virtual backgrounds is that depending on the capabilities of your platform, it may not have a strong enough video card in it, and it'll look very disjointed, and the lines around the individual will be broken. It just won't look good because of the capabilities of the video card. So you just want to consider that when you're considering using a virtual background. Now, as you can see in this virtual background, as I move, sometimes the cutout around me just fades in and out a little bit, and that's just the risk that you take if you use a virtual background. If you're going to use one that's clear and isn't going to be a distraction to the students. You don't want to have something that has a lot of things going on behind it. The reason why I use this background, my real background, is just because it's real, and I'm not worried about the distractions or the picture looking distorted. That's just my own preference. Another thing about setting up your platform, your room, your virtual classroom, is to make sure you're in a quiet area. Ideally, you're in a room where you can close off, especially if you're working from home and there's kids or dogs in the other room. You want to make sure that you can make that room as quiet as you can. You also want to make sure that you don't have any distractions. You know, is my phone on mute? Is my email silenced? As a matter of fact, if I'm going to be using my platform, I want to shut down everything else that's on that computer or running on that computer other than my video camera and my PowerPoint if I'm going to be using PowerPoint. Why? The more things that are open, the more things that are competing for that hard drive or that memory space on my computer. So again, I want to give it all the strength that it can use to make sure that I'm giving the highest quality production to the students. The other thing is bandwidth. If I have something open, I have my browser open, I have my email open, they're continuing to use some of that bandwidth that I'm trying to use for this presentation, for this classroom. So if I can shut down all of those things that might take away from my bandwidth, the better. That goes for other people that might be in the house with you. If you have kids or spouses that are live streaming some video, that all is going to start eating away at your bandwidth capabilities and might contribute to either a disruption or an interruption in your video and what the students are seeing. So think about that. The bottom line is master the technology and maximize your readiness. How do you do that? Comes with practice. I'll get to that when we get to the performance and the presenting part of the P's, but just practice it. Just become comfortable with doing those things. Set up a checklist if you need to on making sure that you've set up for success by shutting off some of those things that might be eating at your bandwidth, or making sure you're in a quiet area, or making sure that your lighting is right in the room that you're in. Those are all things that will contribute to go to the next part and outlining what the process is that you're going to use to deliver your next online course. Okay, so now we're going to talk about process. How are we going to do all this? Once we know our audience and have our tools in hand, this is where we literally roll up our sleeves and get down into the how we're going to deliver this course of instruction in a virtual classroom. So let me break it down into a couple of parts. Your delivery should have three parts, three more P's, if you will. It should have the pre-delivery, it should have the actual or present delivery, and it should have the post-delivery. These are all opportunities for you to engage, prepare, and take your students on this digital learning journey. And so I should have almost three parts of my plan, right? And remember that blended learning is the best virtual experience that we can create for these students, combining synchronous and asynchronous delivery methods. So how do we do this? Well, one way in maximizing that virtual classroom delivery is actually stripping it down a little bit. If I look at the tools and techniques that we've talked about and that I can use to maximize their engagement in the classroom, then I have to also look at what might be worth taking out of the classroom time and putting into asynchronous activities or tasks. Remember, from our people discussion, this might be a way that I can further that whole community type atmosphere and environment that I want to create. And it might help them in working together and establishing those relationships. So off-campus work might actually be of great benefit to me in accomplishing what I want to do in the teaching engagement, but also for them. So I have to kind of design for action. That's what I call it. We need to ensure that we keep the flow of learning going. And we talked briefly why it's important to engage every 3 to 7 minutes. Here's where I literally write it out. Here's where I write my script, if you will. Here's where I have my training plan that says, you know, slide 1 is going to begin here, and here's where I'm going to ask question number 1, or here's where I'm going to start poll number 1, or here's where I'm going to have them use chat to do this. Laying it all out. By the way, this is going to help you with time. Remember, I talk about time being your enemy in this virtual space, or at least operating on in a parallel universe as it relates to the physical classroom. So having this laid out, having my plan detailed out on what my design for action is will help me in managing that time just as well. Another thing to think about as far as the process is establishing and enforcing norms, if you will, in the virtual classroom through organized and detailed expectations. This goes back to the pre part. If I send a good pre-letter, pre-email that outlines what's going to happen and how it's going to happen, this better prepares the students for my classroom. And it takes away a degree of anxiety, because as adults, we all come to the physical classroom the same way we come to the virtual classroom. And that is, we're all thinking about, wait a minute, is this going to be good? Who's going to be in the classroom? How good are these instructors going to be? What are they going to ask me to do? The more I can minimize that type of thought process and anxiety before the student gets to the class, the better experience they're going to have when they do get there. So establishing those norms. In the virtual classroom, some of those norms might be that you mute everybody's audio when you're teaching, or you might want them to unmute. If you want to ensure that there's an ongoing discussion and conversation that happens in your delivery, then set that as the rule. Guess what? I want everybody to unmute so that we can have an open discussion. Because if you have them muted, they're all going to forget to unmute when they start talking. So just eliminate that. Same goes for video. Do I want the videos on or do I want the videos off? For most training evolutions and course content, you want them to have their video on. That goes back to what I was talking about under the people part of the P's, and paying attention and reading my room, reading my audience to see if they're staying with me, if they're engaged, or if they're getting distracted for some reason. So one of the norms I'm going to set is, guess what? Your video is going to stay on and your audio is going to stay on. So don't mute either of those. And if they have to step away, remember we're dealing with adults. Just tell them you've got to step away for some reason. It's okay to mute your video at that time and mute your audio, especially if you're going to take a phone call. But when you come back into the room, put your camera back on so we know you're back in the room. The bottom line of all this is it's about process. It's about identifying and using varied instructional methods and strategies that can apply to various interests and motivations. That's what it's all about. We're taking the same type of instructional strategies we apply in the physical room, and we're going to apply them in the virtual room. It's the same thing. So helping me do that, having a checklist can actually be a great tool here, and actually a couple of checklists. A checklist for my pre-engagement, a checklist for what I'm going to do when I'm presenting, and a checklist for what happens after the fact. Another thing, and the most important of this whole discussion about process, is preparing relentlessly. We all know that to be a good instructor, to be a good teacher, to be a good trainer, the more we prepare before we walk in that classroom, the better we're going to be. It's accentuated here in the virtual world. And here's why. Our mistakes or miscues are magnified. Unlike in the physical classroom, if I miss something, I can always recover. I have a bunch of tools to help me recover in the physical classroom, including my other instructors, including my notes. It's just easier. In the virtual world, all eyes are on me. Everything is being magnified. So the more I can prepare, the more I can eliminate any chance for there being miscues, misstatements, errors, the better I'm going to be. I'm also going to be more comfortable. I'm just going to be more prepared and able to not only do the things that I want to do, but also handle things that go wrong. Murphy is going to show up in every classroom. He always does. So the more I'm prepared, the more I can recover from something that happens. And by the way, one of those checklists is just have what's our plan when Murphy does show up? What happens if I lose my connection in the middle of an instruction? How do we handle that? What's not only my plan, but what's the rest of the instructor cadre's team plan for recovering from that? Having a backup instructor, having a moderator or producer help in executing the polls and things like that. These are all things that'll just make for a better experience. Let's move on to the actual presentation, the actual production, if you will. All right, the final P of the 4 Ps, the actual presentation, the product, if you will, performing all those things that we've talked about preparing for. This is where it gets personal. This is where it's you in front of the camera. And now that we've gone through all those functional elements and prepared appropriately, this is where you as a teacher, as a trainer, as an instructor, do your thing. And here's some things to keep in mind once you're in front of that virtual classroom and how you can utilize the already embedded strengths that you have to maximize the outcome and truly enhance that learning experience. The first thing, and the most important thing, focused on the teaching, not on the technology. Let's remember what this is all about. We focused on a lot of the things that enable or facilitate the process of learning in this virtual environment, but it's really all about you. It's all about the teaching, and try not to get caught up in the technology. Can you do your teaching in such a way and not use all those tools that the platform might have? Of course you can. But if there's something that you can leverage and further enhance that learner experience, then let's try to use it. But let's make the main thing the main thing. And that's the teaching and learning that we want to have happen in our classroom. And in order to do that well, we need to be able to model the understanding of adult learning principles, right? So again, don't forget what you used and applied in that physical classroom and think that that goes away in the virtual classroom. It doesn't. As a matter of fact, it gets accentuated, it gets magnified, and the importance becomes even more critical. So model adult learning principles in this space just as much as you would in the physical space. Foster and don't lose sense of that community, that whole of community that I talked about. Because one of the things people come into a virtual classroom thinking, one of the myths, if you will, is that this isn't going to be like the physical classroom. This is going to stink. I'm not going to like it. I'm going to be stuck in front of the computer for X amount of hours. So if we do a good job of recognizing that that might be one of their preconceived notions, and we focus on fostering that sense of community and create a true learner-centered environment, we nurture that whole of community atmosphere, they're going to take that away, and it's going to change their minds about future application in the virtual world. Another point is, again, it's all about you, so leverage your energy and your passion. Have it come through the screen. How do you do that? Well, part of it is being prepared, right? We talked about that, so that I'm comfortable not only with what I'm teaching, but how I'm going to teach it. I know you're all comfortable with the subject matters that you're experts in, but I'm also going to just let that energy just flow. This is where going natural is okay, and the effect that it'll have on your students. They will tell you stories about teachers that have made an impact in their past. And one of the key ingredients that you'll hear them say over and over again is energy and passion. So let that come through. Whatever empowers that, unleashes that, make sure that you put those capabilities to use. For me, it's again standing up. I just get a little bit more active. I get a little bit more energetic when I'm standing. Not everybody has to do that, but even if you're sitting in a chair, I recommend you sit on the edge of your chair just to let that energy start flowing through you. Make the most of your voice in this virtual setting. Again, it's magnified here. In the classroom, I can get away with not using my voice as dramatically because I can walk around the classroom and get closer to people if I want them really to be engaged and be paying attention. In this space, I might have to use that in different ways. I might have to lower my voice for them to start thinking, what is he saying? I might have to raise my voice. I might have to be passionate about this particular point. So the use of your voice, your pace, and your inflection is going to be more important here than ever before which is why I go back to why audio is so important when you're thinking about the platform and how you're going to set up your classroom. Don't be afraid to use purposeful silence either. We talk about this in the physical classroom. Again, it's magnified here. Silence is okay. Don't feel you have to fill the space if nothing's being said. We talk about this in the physical classroom, but making it relevant in the virtual classroom is, again, even more important. I'm asking them to sit in front of this screen for a period of time, whether it be an hour, or 4 hours, or 24 hours, whatever the total class delivery is. I've got to make sure it's relevant. I've got to make sure it's important to them. This goes to the whole whiff and what's in it for me. But each time I'm talking about a specific subject area or a module, I've got to make it relevant to them. So I got to have them tell me what's relevant. I've got to engage them. I've got to use their experience. One other thing, when you're actually doing the presentation, the teaching, the performance, if you will, you have to be able to multitask. Again, in the classroom, the physical classroom, we can get away with this. We can focus purely on our teaching and using whatever tools that we have. But in this realm, I've got to multitask. I've got to be able to pay attention to you on the screen. I've got to be looking into that camera so that I'm maintaining eye contact. I've got to be reading my notes wherever those are, whether they be up on the screen or on my desk. I've got to be watching where I am relative to the slide presentation. I've got to be paying attention to chat if I'm asking them to use chat. And even if not, if there's something or they're asking a question in that area, I've got to be paying attention to it. And I've got to deal for any changes that I'm going to be building into this. If I'm going to ask them to use, if I'm going to ask a poll, I've got to be able to launch the poll. I've got to be able to stop the poll. If I'm going to ask them to raise their hand, I need to monitor that and be able to put their hands down. There's a lot of things that I have to be able to do in this space. So you have to be able to multitask. How do you get there? I go back to what I said before. I practice relentlessly so that I can feel more comfortable with all those tools. You adapt in the virtual classroom by managing time, by adhering to course objectives and the flow of the learning and accommodating participant needs and expectations. That definition, what I just said, is no different from the physical classroom. We still have to manage our time there. We still have to adhere to what the course objectives are. We still have to make sure the learning flow happens, and we have to accommodate the different participant needs and expectations. It's just accentuated here. We just have to pay closer attention to it. So lastly, prepare for those unexpected challenges. They will happen. The better prepared, the better practice that I do, the more prepared I will be for those challenges. And here's a thing that becomes your best friend, the record button. Use it. Use it for yourself just to be able to look at it afterwards and say, hey, how could I have done this a little bit better? How could I, what I call, polish the stone? You polish the stone by practice, by purposely and continuously finding ways to be better tomorrow than you were today. And it's much more magnified here, as I've said time and time again. If I practice well, if I prepare well, if I'm purposeful in it, I can ensure that that digital learning experience happens and is an enjoyable one that the students are going to take away and recognize as one of the best experiences that they have. The bottom line is the virtual classroom is here to stay, folks. And if we approach it with the right mindset, we'll foster and nurture that great learner-centered journey that I talked about. And we'll be better teachers, instructors, and trainers, even when we get back to the physical classroom, because we'll be able to apply these things there. Good luck.